Manhattan was drowning. A cold, aggressive rain lashed against the windows of the yellow cab, mirroring the storm of desperation inside Sarah Miller's chest. In her arms lay Lily, her 4-year-old daughter, whose skin felt like a furnace and whose breath was a terrifying, shallow rattle. Sarah was a woman carved from grief. 5 years ago, in this very city, she had been handed a cold metal box and told it contained the ashes of the only man she had ever loved, Dr. Mark Vance. Eleanor Vance, the billionaire matriarch with ice in her veins, had looked Sarah in the eye and said, "My son is dead. You and the bastard child in your womb are nothing but a stain on our legacy." Sarah had believed her. She had spent 5 years scrubbing floors and skipping meals, raising a daughter who only knew her father from a single crumpled photograph hidden in a Bible. But as Sarah burst through the emergency room doors of Manhattan Central, clutching her dying child, she felt a sudden, violent jolt of electricity in the air. The smell of antiseptic didn't bring comfort, it brought back the taste of death. "Sarah Miller? Take her to exam room 7, a nurse barked. Sarah ran. She didn't just walk, she ran as if death were chasing her. She burst into the room, her lungs screaming, her eyes blurred by tears. A man stood there. Tall, broad-shouldered, a white coat that looked like a shroud. He was staring at a monitor, his back turned. "Good evening," he said. Sarah's heart didn't just beat, it stopped. That voice. It wasn't just a sound, it was a memory of every "I love you" whispered in the dark. It was the voice of a man who had been buried for 5 years. The doctor turned around, and the world disintegrated. It was Mark. Her Mark. But as his emerald eyes met hers, there was no fire, no recognition, only the terrifying, polite emptiness of a stranger looking at a ghost. The silence in room 7 was a physical weight, heavy enough to crush the bones. Sarah stood paralyzed, her hands trembling so violently that she nearly dropped Lily. She wanted to scream. She wanted to reach out and touch the scar on his temple, to see if he was made of flesh or the mist of her own madness. "Ma'am? You need to breathe," Mark said, stepping toward her. Every step he took toward her was a violation of the laws of the universe. Mark Vance was supposed to be dust. He was supposed to be a name on a marble headstone that Sarah visited every Sunday. But here he was, smelling of the same sandalwood soap and hospital air, his pulse visible in the hollow of his throat. I am breathing," Sarah whispered, her voice a jagged ruin. "But I think I've died. I think I died and went to the hell you left me in." Mark's brow furrowed. A flicker of something, pain, confusion, crossed his face, but it was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by a professional mask. "The fever is dangerously high. 104.8. We need to start a cooling blanket and N4 immediately. What is her name?" Sarah looked at him, and for a second, she hated him. She hated him for being alive while she was drowning. She hated him for having a clean white coat while her shoes were falling apart. "Her name is Lily," she spat, her eyes burning with a raw, visceral agony. "Lily Margaret. After the grandmother who taught you how to pray. Do you remember how to pray, Mark? Or did your mother buy you a new soul to go with your new life?" Mark froze. The thermometer in his hand hit the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces, but he didn't look down. He looked at Lily. He looked at the chestnut curls matted with sweat. He looked at the tiny star-shaped birthmark on her shoulder, the same one Sarah had told him about in their tiny sun-drenched apartment 5 years ago. A sudden blinding pain erupted behind Mark's eyes. A cacophony of sounds flooded his mind, the screech of tires, the smell of burning rubber, and a woman's voice screaming, "Mark, watch out." He stumbled back, clutching his head, his breathing coming in jagged gasps. I don't know you," he wheezed, but his eyes were wide with terror. "My mother. She said I was alone. She said the accident wiped away a life that wasn't worth remembering." "Not worth remembering?" Sarah stepped into his space, her face inches from his. She took his hand and forced it onto Lily's burning forehead. "This is your blood, Mark. This is the distraction your mother told me to abort. Look at her. Look at her eyes and tell me you don't see yourself. Lily stirred, her small hand reaching out in her sleep, brushing against Mark's sleeve. "Daddy," she whimpered, the word a tiny fragile thread in the storm. Mark collapsed to his knees. The sophisticated surgeon, the pride of the Vance dynasty, was gone. In his place was a man being torn apart by the return of a soul he didn't know he had lost. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time in 5 years, the fog in his eyes cleared. He didn't see a stranger. He saw the girl who used to share his last $5 for a slice of pizza. He saw the woman he had promised to protect with his life. "Sarah," he whispered, the name a sob that broke the silence of the room. But before the reunion could take flight, the door was thrown open. Eleanor Vance stood there, her diamonds glittering like cold stars, her eyes fixed on Sarah with a lethal predatory glare. "Mark, get away from that woman," Eleanor commanded, her voice like a whip. "Security is on the way. She's an extortionist. She's been stalking this family for years. She's using that sick child to trap you." Sarah turned, her grief turning into a mother's lethal fury. "Stalking? You handed me a death certificate, Eleanor. You told me he was ashes. You let me raise his daughter in a basement while you played God with his mind. I gave him a future." Eleanor shrieked. "I gave him a life where he didn't have to worry about rent or a common waitress. I saved him from you." Mark stood up slowly. He looked at his mother, the woman who had rebuilt his brain but destroyed his heart. Then he looked at Sarah, who was shielding Lily with her own body. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was an awakening. "You didn't save me, Mother," Mark said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You murdered me. And tonight, the man you created is dying. But the father you tried to kill? He's finally wide awake." He reached out and took Sarah's hand, his grip a vow. The war had just begun, but as the rain continued to roar outside, Sarah knew one thing for certain: the ghost in room 7 was no longer a ghost. He was a father, and he was coming for everything they had lost. Mark Miller, because the name Vance now felt like a noose around his neck, stood in the middle of room 7, his world spinning. He looked at Eleanor, the woman he had called mother for 30 years, and for the first time, he didn't see a protector. He saw a monster wrapped in Chanel and diamonds. The silence in the room was no longer medical, it was the silence of a crime scene. "Security. Now." Eleanor screamed into her gold-plated phone, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "This woman is dangerous. She's delusional." But Mark didn't move. He stood like a pillar of salt, his eyes fixed on the tiny sweating girl in the bed. His daughter. The word echoed in his mind, a heartbeat he had been deaf to for 5 years. Every time Lily whimpered, a piece of the life Eleanor had built for him crumbled into dust. "Dangerous." Sarah laughed, and the sound was so sharp it could have cut glass. She stepped toward Eleanor, ignoring the security guards rushing toward the door. She didn't look like a waitress from the Bronx anymore. She looked like an avenging angel. "The only thing dangerous in this room, Eleanor, is the truth. You spent 5 years painting me as a ghost, but ghosts don't have pulses. Ghosts don't have the scars of C-sections you forced me to undergo alone in a charity ward while you were sipping champagne." "Sarah, stop," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out to touch her arm, but Sarah spun around, her eyes flashing with a pain so raw it made Mark flinch. "Stop? You want me to stop now, Mark?" Sarah's voice rose to a guttural scream. "I spent 2,000 nights stopping myself from crying so Lily wouldn't hear me. Stopping myself from jumping off the George Washington Bridge because I thought you were dead. I sat in a graveyard every Sunday talking to a headstone while you were performing surgeries in this building. You don't get to tell me to stop." Mark fell back against the wall, the weight of her words crushing the air from his lungs. He remembered. It was coming back now, not in images, but in sensations. The smell of the cheap lavender soap Sarah used. The way she would tuck her cold feet under his legs on their sagging sofa. The night they had split a single cupcake to celebrate his residency. He hadn't been a distraction. He had been alive. Eleanor, Mark said, his voice dropping to a terrifying low growl. He turned to his mother, and the look in his eyes made the billionaire matriarch take a step back. You told me the accident wiped away a life of mistakes. You told me I was alone. You looked me in the eye every day for 5 years and watched me mourn a hole in my soul that you created. I did it for the family, Mark. Eleanor shrieked, her poise finally shattering. Look at this hospital. Look at the Vance Plaza. You were going to throw it all away for a girl who cleans tables. I saved your future. You didn't save my future, Mark said, walking slowly toward her, each step a vow of war. You stole my past. You let my daughter grow up in a basement while I lived in a penthouse. You let the woman I loved believe I was ashes. You aren't a mother, Eleanor. You're a thief. At that moment, the security guards burst in. Sir, step away from Mrs. Vance, the lead guard commanded, reaching for his holster. Mark didn't even look at them. He walked straight to the bed and picked up Lily. She was small, feverish, and smelled of the rain Sarah had brought in with her. He tucked her head under his chin, feeling her shallow breath against his neck. It was the first time he had held her as a father, and the sensation was so profound he felt his soul finally snap back into place. If any of you touch her or her mother, Mark said to the guards, his voice vibrating with a lethal authority, I will ensure that Vance Industries isn't just ruined, I will ensure it is erased from the history of this city. I know every illegal offshore account Eleanor uses to fund her charities. I know who she paid to forge my death certificate. Try me. The guards hesitated. They knew Mark Vance. They knew he was the only one who truly held the keys to the Vance empire. They looked at Eleanor, then at the floor. Mark, be reasonable, Eleanor pleaded, her voice trembling. Think of the scandal. Think of your career. My career died 5 years ago in that car crash, Eleanor, Mark said, taking Sarah's hand. Along with your son. The man standing here now? He doesn't belong to you. He belongs to the woman you tried to destroy. Sarah looked at Mark, and for a fleeting second, the 5 years of hell vanished. She saw the boy who had promised to love her until the stars fell. She saw the man who was willing to burn his kingdom to keep her warm. She gripped his hand, her knuckles white, her heart finally finding its rhythm after half a decade of silence. They walked out of room 7, leaving Eleanor Vance screaming in the middle of the hospital she thought she owned. They walked past the nurses, past the flashing lights, and out into the New York rain. It was still cold. It was still pouring. But as they stepped into a waiting cab, Mark didn't feel the chill. He held Lily in one arm and Sarah in the other. As the taxi pulled away from the hospital, Mark looked back at the Vance sign glowing on the building. Take us to the Bronx, he told the driver. The Bronx, sir? The driver asked, looking at Mark's expensive coat in the rearview mirror. Yeah, Mark said, leaning his head against Sarah's. Take us home. But as the car sped through the dark streets, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She knew Eleanor. She knew the depths of the woman's malice. This wasn't the end. This was the moment the dragon was wounded, and a wounded dragon is the most dangerous creature on earth. She won't let us go, Mark, Sarah whispered, clutching his hand. Mark looked at her, his emerald eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. Let her come, Sarah. I spent 5 years being a puppet. Tonight, I'm the one pulling the strings. And I'm going to make sure that before this is over, Eleanor Vance learns exactly what it costs to steal a father's love. The cramped apartment in the Bronx smelled of cheap soup and warm steam, a jagged contrast to the cold clinical luxury Mark had left behind. Mark Miller, he had stripped the name Vance away like a layer of rotted skin, sat on the edge of a creaking wooden bed, watching Lily sleep. Her small, fragile hand was curled around his thumb, a grip that felt more grounding than any billion-dollar contract he had ever signed. Beside him, Sarah stood in the shadows, her eyes fixed on their reflection in a cracked, dusty mirror. We're in the wolf's den, Mark, she whispered, her voice a ragged rasp of exhaustion. Your mother won't let us breathe. She owns the police, the lawyers, and every headline in this city. She'll crush us before the sun comes up. Mark stood, pulling Sarah into the circle of his arms. He looked into her eyes, eyes that had wept for 5 years because of his cowardice. She owns the city, Sarah. But I own her secrets. For 5 years, I was her favorite puppet. I saw the rot beneath the diamonds. Tonight, the storm isn't just hitting New York. It's hitting the gates of her penthouse. Eleanor Vance did not waste a second. By sunrise, the Manhattan media landscape erupted. Kidnapping at Central Hospital, Dr. Mark Vance taken hostage by unstable former lover. The Bronx apartment block was swarmed by police cruisers. Sirens wailed, slicing through the morning quiet, a psychological blitz designed to make Sarah crawl back and beg for mercy. But Eleanor had underestimated one thing: a man who has just found his soul is no longer afraid of the dark. Mark walked out of that apartment building alone, his hands raised, but his eyes were like flint. In front of a dozen news cameras and the barrels of police rifles, Mark didn't surrender. Instead, he pulled a small black flash drive from his pocket. I am not a hostage. Mark's voice boomed through the microphones of the reporters scrambling forward. I have just woken up from a 5-year coma induced by the woman you call Philanthropist of the Year. The world seemed to stop spinning. Mark began to leak the truth right there on the pavement. He revealed the evidence he had gathered during his time as Eleanor's unwitting doll. Illegal medical records showing his memory had been chemically suppressed. Bank statements showing bribes paid to hospital officials to forge his death certificate. And the final killing blow, a recording of Eleanor from the night before, admitting she had left Sarah to rot in the streets to keep the Vance legacy pure. She forged my death to turn me into a heartless robot. Mark screamed directly into the camera, knowing Eleanor was watching from her silk sheets. She stole 5 years from a child who needed her father. Today, the Vance dynasty doesn't fall because of money, it falls because of the truth. Within hours, public opinion turned like a tidal wave. The people of New York, who had once worshipped the Vances, now demanded justice for Sarah and Lily. Eleanor Vance, who had just ordered champagne to celebrate her win, instead found the doors of her penthouse kicked in by federal agents. No longer a queen, she was dragged out in handcuffs, her polished face hidden behind matted hair, while the camera flashes she once loved now captured the pathetic collapse of an empire built on lies. 6 months later. The air in the Hudson Valley was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the weightless feeling of hope. In a small wooden house far from the shadows of Manhattan skyscrapers, Mark stood on the porch, watching Lily run through the tall grass. She was no longer pale, her cheeks were flushed pink, and her laughter filled the air like the most beautiful symphony ever written. Sarah walked out, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and leaned her head on Mark's shoulder. They didn't have billions anymore. They had liquidated what was left of the Vance estate and donated it to a foundation for the invisible children of New York. Mark was now working in a small country clinic, where every life he saved gave him a satisfaction that his prestigious surgical career never could. What are you thinking about? Sarah asked softly. Mark pulled her into his embrace, kissing her forehead with a devotion that bordered on worship. I'm thinking about that night in the hospital. About the $100 I tried to hand you with such arrogance. I didn't know then that I was actually buying a ticket back to my own life. Lily ran up to them, holding a small repaired wooden guitar. Daddy, look. I can play the song Mommy taught me. Mark knelt, taking the guitar and plucking the strings. It was the same lullaby Sarah had sung for 5 years in the silence of her grief. This time, they sang it together. No more ghosts. No more lies. I love you, Sarah, Mark whispered between the lyrics. Thank you for never giving up on the man who was too blind to see you. Sarah smiled, tears of genuine peace finally washing over her face. That man is gone, Mark. All I see is my husband, and the father of my child. Under the golden light of the setting sun, the Miller family stood together. They had walked through hell, fought the dragon, and shattered the glass castle. They had lost 5 years, but they had won something that all the gold in the world couldn't buy, a new beginning, where love was the only law that mattered. The journey of Mark, Sarah, and Lily has finally reached its harbor. A long road from the darkness of amnesia back into the light of the truth. Justice has been served, and Eleanor Vance is left to rot in the cage she built with her own greed. Thank you for staying with us through this raw, emotional journey until the very last second. This story serves as a reminder that no matter how much wealth a person has, they are truly poor without love in their heart. If this finale moved your soul and gave you the peace you were looking for, please type happy ending in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support us in bringing you more stories that don't just entertain, but touch the deepest parts of the human spirit. Until next time, remember, the truth will always find its way home.